time with us.
It's a pleasure.
I reached out to your daughter. She said she didn't have
Thank
anything
you.
to send.
Thank you.
You wanted the granddaughter. We could have probably took her for a couple bags. But we so appreciate this opportunity to visit with you, and we hope that Sarah feels better.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much, and really delighted to be with all of you. Vancouver obviously has a special place in our hearts, and we were so looking forward to hosting you. And Sarah sends her regrets. And this is I think this is a moment where we're being hit from so many directions simultaneously that it's hard to really get one's bearing. And I still have not begun to process October 7th. And I think that that's true for, it's true for many of us, that we're still learning some pretty basic details about what happened. I still haven't processed the fact that, as we were speaking about a moment ago, we lost to Hamas. We lost the public relations battle among progressives to Hamas. There are so many surreal facets to this moment that it's hard to really process where we are. And the ongoing war, and honestly, the way we're experiencing the war here is very different from the way diaspora Jews are experiencing it. We don't see the images from Gaza for the most part. We see the ruins when we see footage of the soldiers fighting. We don't really see what you're seeing. And honestly, I think that even if we did, I'm not sure it would really matter to most Israelis. And I'm not speaking just about the right or the center, I'm speaking about the left. One of the major disconnects is how left-wing Israelis and left-wing American Jews are experiencing this moment. I was on a panel last week of Israeli writers that was sponsored by PEN, the International Writers Organization. And I was the only one on the panel who did not identify as left. I'm in the center. And if my co-panelists had been diaspora Jews, they would be out demonstrating for a ceasefire. And yet, all of them said, we are with this war to the end. Only victory. And one of them said to me afterwards, someone who's quite left, a friend of mine, who said, I have to keep reminding myself that Gazans are suffering, and I have to keep reminding myself that I should care. And he said, you can imagine, if that's what I'm going through, imagine what's happening on the street here. So, on the one hand, there's that. There is this disconnect over the angst of Gaza. And on the other hand, there's this extraordinary moment that I think is certainly, look, I know the American Jewish community, but I think this is true for Canadian Jewry as well, that this is the first time where we are vulnerable together. We're diaspora, well, European Jews have obviously felt vulnerable for a long time. But I think for North American Jews and for Israelis, what we learned on October 7th and what you learned on October 8th was that we're not as secure as we thought we were. That's true for both centers. And that's on the one hand, of course, it's terrifying. On the other hand, it really opens the way for, I think, a new conversation between diaspora Jews and Israelis. And for the first time, there's an emotional equilibrium between the two communities. And I think that's something that we really need to build on when this is over. And really think about how do we reconceive of the relationship on a new basis, because what was cannot be in any sphere. But I'm thinking especially about the increasingly strained relations, which certainly came to a crisis point in the US, and I think was heading there for some parts of Canadian Jewry, maybe more slowly, but I think that it was heading in that direction too. And so this is a moment to really pull back and ask ourselves the question of what did we do wrong? And that's a question for both sides to answer, because the relationship has been increasingly dysfunctional. We can't go back to the old relationship where either on one side of the community it's Israel no matter what, and we have no right to critique or criticize, or on the other hand, the relationship was increasingly only criticism. And we need to be Jewish grown-ups together. And we've never been Jewish grown-ups together, the diaspora in Israel. Either in the early decades of the state, we were the grown-ups and the diaspora were children. That's how we treated the diaspora. Or increasingly, diaspora impatience. And again, I'm speaking, forgive me, from the diaspora that I know best, which is American Jewry. This sense of moral superiority that we've been hearing more and more from the left side of American Jewry, and that Israel has lost its way, and we need to have a very different kind of conversation where we in Israel respect the diaspora as equals, where we have an interest in the diaspora not only when you're experiencing anti-Semitism, but what your Jewish lives are actually like. Israelis, as you know, don't have a clue. And what I need from diaspora Jews is an appreciation of Israel's vulnerability and not just lectures on the occupation. And I think that this is an opportunity to really start readjusting the relationship. Please.
That would be a dream come true, I think, for all of us. Where my nervousness is, I look at Israeli politics at a time where we're supposed to be pushing politics aside. It's seeing very like the ideological drivers in the Knesset, the fringe elements of coalition. I don't get the sense that they even recognize that the Israeli street is, our driver, not our driver, Turpak said, there's this feeling that the budget is not going to reflect the real needs of the country at the moment.
Fair to say. So look, I think that let me take a step back and say something very counterintuitive, which is that I am much more hopeful about Israel today than I was before October 7th. This past year was the hardest year that I've ever experienced. I made Aliyah into the Israeli schism. I moved here in August 1982, which was the beginning of the first Lebanon War, when the country was tearing itself apart over war, which always united us. And so I was, to some extent, I was prepared, but nothing prepared me for what this last year was like. And looking back, I realized that I was in a state of low-level clinical depression, where I really didn't know if this country was going to survive intact. If you had told me that we're going to have a war in a few months, and the country was going to pull together as if it were 1973, and I don't think we've been as united in war, about the war, as we have been since 1973, I wouldn't have believed it. I didn't think we were capable of it. The fact that we pivoted from October 6th to October 8th is astonishing to me, which means that we still have it in us. Now, the schisms have not gone away at all, but the balance within Israeli opinion has dramatically shifted. The latest poll was 80% want Netanyahu to either resign now or resign after the war. 80%. I asked myself, who's the 20%? But okay. And the other reason why I feel hopeful about Israel is because even though the issues remain, we, I believe, are going to resolve our issues internally in a different way than this government tried to do this year, which is to impose its will on at least half the country that deeply opposed its worldview. Now, we went through something similar in the 1990s when the left, the government of Rabin and Peres, tried to impose the Oslo process on half the country and did so with a fake parliamentary majority. They did not have a majority for the Oslo process. They effectively bribed, a right-wing Knesset member to move over to the pro-Oslo camp, and that's how they passed a 61-seat majority for the Oslo process. We can't do things that way anymore. It will have to be either a 2/3 vote in the Knesset, a referendum for issues that are considered by the country fateful, as the assault on democracy was, as the Oslo process was. We can't continue navigating our differences in that way. And I think that is something that's going to change. The judicial coup is off the table, and the unconscionable grab of funds that we're seeing happening in the Knesset now is partly, I think, the last attempt by those forces to take as much as they can, because they know that they will lose the next election. The question is, how do we bring them down? I can tell you that there are many, many of us in this country who are waiting for the day after the war to go back into the streets and not leave. I'm ready at age 70 to go to jail. And I hear this over and over from people. We will fill the prisons, we'll sit in the streets. This government will not have a moment respite as soon as this war is over. And so I'm very hopeful about that as well. We will shut down the country if necessary. This government cannot stand.
I didn't hear, I'm sorry, when you said what you need from the diaspora.
Well, the first thing that I need is from critics, from the left, is an acknowledgement of Israel's predicament and vulnerability, so that when we hear criticism about it, the absence of a two-state solution, which I, to some extent, share, at least couple that with an appreciation of why Israelis have been resistant to creating a Palestinian state in the West Bank, which could risk replicating Gaza on our most sensitive border. So that's one thing. The other is what I expect from both sides, which is curiosity about each other's culture. And the fact that diaspora Jews don't know Israeli music, for example, which I think is one of the greatest contributions to Jewish civilization in our time that has come from here. Israeli music is just world class, is really a scandal, in the same way that Israelis don't know the richness of diaspora Jewish pluralism. That's a scandal. And so what we have now is a dysfunctional relationship that's based entirely on politics, on either support for Israel politically or criticism of Israel politically. Now, that's obviously an important part of the relationship. It can't be the entirety of the relationship. So I actually feel that we are heading. Well, look, when I say that I'm an optimist, I'm an Israeli optimist. we are heading toward like some of the worst months in this country's history are coming up. And I expect the war to expand to the north and maybe to Iran and maybe to Yemen. I think we're on the verge of a regional war. And I also think that we have to fight a regional war. I think if this war ends with Hezbollah on our northern border, then we lost. To say nothing of Gaza, Hamas. So I'm an optimist, but in any other normal situation, I would be considered, a person who is in deep despair, which I'm actually not. So
I was going to ask what you think has changed with regard to Israeli attitudes towards what the needs of the Palestinian people are, what's happening to them. It sounds like that will be put off by a bigger war.
yeah, I'll use myself as an example. I wrote a book called Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. I've spent the last 10 years reaching out to Muslims in North America. We have a program at Hartman with a very strong Canadian participation as well, and reaching out to Palestinians. I could not do that work today. Not interested. I couldn't write that book today. I'm very glad I wrote it. I'm glad it's out there, and I hope someday to be able to own it again. I can't bear to look at it. Somebody was saying they just read it on the plane. Yeah. I couldn't. So, why? Speaking about, there are two levels. There's the conceptual, the political level, and there's the emotional level. Emotionally, I'm not there. I'm not available for a discussion on the occupation, for a very simple reason. October 7th had nothing to do with the occupation. Absolutely nothing. It was about 1948 and not 1967. And to hear Obama and others, the UN Secretary General, saying there's a context here. Well, yeah, there's a context, but it's not the context that they think. And the context is genocide. That's the context. And so emotionally, what we saw on October 7th and after October 7th was a mini replay of the Palestinian tragedy. They attack, they do something outrageous, we respond, and we win, and they immediately go into victim mode. Not fair. You're not supposed to be attacking us. And you have no right to attack us, as I heard recently from, I forget who it was, one of the Hamas leaders. Israel has no right to attack because Israel has no legitimacy. If you're an apartheid colonialist state, then whatever act of war you do is by definition a war crime, because we have no right to defend ourselves. We have no legitimacy. So emotionally, it's not that I don't care. I'm numb. I'm frozen. And I think that's true for Israelis who ordinarily do care. For the many Israelis who ordinarily don't care, obviously, that's a different set of emotional responses.
in this situation?
Yeah, yeah. I would say that I have I'm not, for myself, I'm not. And I also really try in my davening to keep Palestinians in mind. That's where I try to force myself to do it. It's not easy, but I try to do that. It's not that I'm conflating Palestinians with Hamas, but I think the other element here is that the reaction of so much of the world has been so excessive, so to coin a phrase, so disproportionate, that my reaction, and I think this is really true amongst so many people here, is to go deeply into defensive mode. And when you're in that state, it's very hard to be emotionally generous. And the impact of world criticism on Israel is exactly the opposite of what they would hope. It doesn't work. In the same way that Hamas thought that they would terrorize Israel. I mean, one of the things that I'm just beginning to understand about October 7th was that the atrocities were not a byproduct. They were the strategy. It was an attempt to terrorize us and to convince the Israelis that we have no future here, because we're facing an enemy that's prepared to do absolutely anything. And what we need to do in response to that is not let them know that we're ready to do absolutely anything, because we're not, but we're certainly ready to defy the entire world if necessary. We are ready to stomach very large numbers of civilian casualties. We are ready, and this is something that we're not saying out loud, and I would never say this out loud, but I think a majority of the Israeli public are ready, if necessary, to sacrifice the remaining hostages in order to win. Sacrifice the remaining hostages, especially now that we got most of the children and their mothers out.
Is that something you see as like a 55-45 majority, or like a
70-30? It's not spoken about. I'm just giving you my sense, and no one can really bear saying that out loud, including the government. But we're certainly acting in a way that is risking their lives. And so if we're ready to, if we're endangering the lives of hostages, innocent Palestinians, collateral damage. It's a terrible phrase. But so it's all of those factors together. Now, conceptually, about a Palestinian state, it's going to be an impossible sell in the short term, even for Israelis like me, who believe that we need a two-state solution. But I'm holding out two possibilities. One is a regional agreement. We bring in the Saudis, we bring in the Gulf states, and from what I hear, the Saudis are still interested in a deal. They can't say so publicly now, but if you paid attention, the Crown Prince said recently he called for a ceasefire and he called for the release of hostages. That's more than some Jewish demonstrators are doing. And so he's sending us signals. My hope is that the morning after, we're going to get together with the Gulf states, with the Saudis, with Egypt, and figure out what do we do about Gaza. That Gaza becomes a project of the Abraham Accords countries. Now that's my hope. Is it likely to happen? With this government, nothing will happen.
Will that happen with Yehuda and Sharon? If Gaza succeeds, will Yehuda and Sharon be a different question?
If Gaza's not going to succeed. Let's be realistic.
Even under the Abraham Accords.
It's not going to succeed. But I mean, what does succeed mean? What does succeed mean? I don't have a clue of what success in Gaza looks like. It's keeping people from starving. What is it? having people starting to rebuild. What kind of a political arrangement is going to be there? But in Judea and Samaria, my hope is, and this again, this is more long term, is that we will have some regional arrangement where together with Arab countries, we will have a very strong military presence there, even after if we pull back to the settlement blocks. Now, one of the things that the Palestinians lost on October 7th is any chance of a truly independent state. It's not going to happen. In our generation, that's over. I can see some protectorate with Arab countries, some quasi-independence, entirely demilitarized. Whatever they thought they were going to have in a two-state solution, they will not have. I could see the Trump plan, which I thought was ludicrous when it came out. I could see the Trump plan being a basis that, together with the Saudis and the Gulf states, we will force on the Palestinians. October 7th is an historic defeat for the Palestinian national movement. I don't know if they realize it, but I can tell you, just on the basis of what I'm feeling here and looking at myself, what I'm prepared to consider now, it's not going to be what I was prepared to consider October 6th.
You said that you see the Israeli left really being united behind the war. Are there
For the most part.
I guess like within that, is there a shading of strategies that they're supporting, or the way that the war is happening, or kind of imagery or language?
Can I ask a question again? Because and speaking about, you shared that 80% of Israelis are united behind
The war?
stepping
Oh,
down
that, yeah.
one way or another.
90% supports destroying Hamas as the goal of the war. 90%.
The 80%, but it doesn't say that they're united for what will come next.
No, not at all. We will be divided. No, but what will come next, if we look at the judicial coup, my guess will be 70-30. That's where we are now. We were all, before October 7th, we were 60-40, or even more. We're at least 70-30. Sorry?
70-30.
On the judicial coup.
Again.
There will not be a judicial transformation. We need, by consensus, to figure out how do we have real reform, because it needs reform. The system needs reform. But it doesn't need a bulldozer, which is what the government was planning. So
I didn't want to overlook the question. In my mind, there was so much.
Yeah, no, I mean, just, because I think one of the challenges, as you were mentioning, obviously the left in North America is so disconnected from, what's happening in Israel, and especially what is happening among the Israeli left, is, like, what does it look like to bridge that gap? And, is there still a sort of space of, like, understanding why, is there still a sort of difference between the Israeli mainstream and, a progressive Israeli attitude towards?
I mean, look, just to give you an example, there's serious talk now about uniting what's left of the Labor Party and Meretz, right? Meretz did not get into the Knesset this time. Labor did. Labor would not get into the next one, and Meretz will. So we're talking about playing what the left has basically are 6 seats. That's generous. The most likely candidate to head the United List, and Labor has, I think, now that Merav Michaeli has resigned, the 3 remaining Knesset members of Labor, each one of them are terrific. I would not vote Labor, but I think they're terrific. The person most likely to head this joint list will not come from Labor. It is likely to be Yair Golan. Yair Golan was the former deputy IDF chief of staff who was a hero on October 7th. He drove into the kibbutzim, went into the music festival and pulled people out. And sorry,
He was like the grandfather.
that was another one.
Oh,
That was another one. That was Amir Tibon's father, Amir Tibon, the Haaretz reporter. And so, yeah, so think about a general being the head of a united left. And that gives you some, it would never have happened before October 7th. Impossible. Meretz would want a general. He ran in primaries for Meretz. He lost by a landslide. And now people are turning to him. He's the only one who has a chance of making the left attractive to some voters. So if you're asking how to bridge the diaspora left and the Israeli left, look, I need a diaspora moral voice on the Palestinians, precisely because we here are incapable now of really facing that. That's really something that, for the sake of the credibility, the moral credibility of the Jewish people, we need that voice. But we need that voice different than it was before October 7th. Of the next government. We'll get to the next government in a moment. I just want to.
Their sense of Israel's vulnerability as a balance.
Yes, we need. I want diaspora Jews to have a voice here, to have a say. But when I hear J Street, and J Street, was surprisingly good on the ceasefire. They're starting to lose it now. But in the past, when I would hear J Street, I would say, and I speak for J Street. I'm AIPAC. I'm not J Street, but I'll speak if they invite me. I'll speak there. They're part of my broad tent. Of course they are. But I want that voice to have credibility in Israel, and it has to change. So that's where, look, I think that the diaspora left can help reinvigorate the moral blockage of Israeli liberals. We need to hear that. But in order to hear that, we really need to hear an acknowledgement that you share something of what we're going through here. And that you're not going to just lapse back into lecturing us about the occupation and about civilian casualties. You're going to take really seriously why we need to destroy Hamas. And on the basis of that conversation, okay, now how do we do that? Is there a better way that we can do that? That's a conversation that some Israelis can have. I can have that conversation. I can't have a conversation with people who are calling for a ceasefire. It's not, we're not speaking the same language. Yes.
Say a little bit about how October 7th changed, if at all, kind of the response of the broad Israeli public to settler violence and the worries about how that could ignite another front.
Look, my sense is, and I don't know if this is true, but my sense is that settler violence has calmed down. And if it's calmed down, it means that the Shabak, the Shin Bet, is on top of it. And I think that the very necessary criticism from the Biden administration may have had an impact on the Israeli government, which then told the Jewish division of the Shabak to pay more attention. But right now I'm worried about something else, which is Ben Gvir running around the country handing out M16s to the worst people in this country. He's handing, God knows what is happening out there and what price we're going to pay. And I'm very worried about police cracking down on Arab-Israeli dissent. They're cracking down not only on people who have expressed support for Hamas, but who have expressed sympathy or concern about civilian casualties. Now, how can Arab Israelis not be concerned about casualties in Gaza. And there are some very difficult stories. Ben Gvir is creating his own little fascist militia, and he is trying to turn the Israeli police, which I wouldn't call the Israeli police a paragon of moral sensitivity to begin with. And he is now under the radar. We don't know what he's doing to the police, but we just had this terrible incident last week where a settler, a hilltop settler in uniform, killed an Israeli who he mistook for a terrorist. The Israeli who had surrendered. He had opened his shirt, he was holding his hands up, and he killed him because it was a mistake, he says. He thought he was a terrorist. Now, according to the rules of engagement, that's a crime. And so the norms are starting to waver here. And the message that's being conveyed by this government, by Ben Gvir, Smotrich, to people like that, is that we have your back now. The old norms are out. That's what worries me. It's so much bigger than settler violence. It's really looking at the impact on what we always took for granted as Israeli norms. And we can't take that for granted anymore.
So, to get to the end part, but so how does that get reined in? I mean, how we're a war and then some time from election. There doesn't seem to be any mechanism.
It's going to be a very big civil confrontation here.
Also, before the election.
Before the elections.
Also,
Yep.
During the war, there'll be a civil confrontation?
I hope not. It's not what people want. There are demonstrations now that have begun again against the government. And as you know, I was out there every week, but I wouldn't go now. I think it's not politically smart. Israelis don't want that. It can alienate people who are otherwise sympathetic to us.
Sorry, last part of this. So when you talked before about a regional war and that one needing to happen and not being able to go to bed at night with Hezbollah having 150,000 rockets on the border in Iran and the whole thing. So will some, I'm sure, say, as they have now, that that conflict in the streets, that internal conflict that Israel was having over the last 10 months before October 7th, created an opening, a peak path for people for Hamas to take this opportunity to break whatever is going to happen with Saudi Arabia. And I'm sure that would be a criticism of whatever protest movement develops the day after the war also.
Yeah, it will. It is. And you hear that. There is overwhelming consensus that the primary responsibility belongs to the government. Now, in terms of the protest movement, I have no regrets. I think that if we hadn't taken to the streets, we would now have a whole set of laws in place that would effectively have nullified Israeli democracy. We forget what the original plan was. The plan was that a simple Knesset override of 61 seats would be enough to veto any ruling by the Supreme Court. That would have been the end of Israeli democracy. The only thing that stopped that was the protest movement. If the judicial transformation had happened, I don't know that Israelis would have been capable right now of coming together even after October 7th. I'm not sure. I think people would have said, what are we fighting for? Right. Let the Haredim send their kids. Let Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who are both basically draft dodgers, let them go. Let them fight. That's what you were hearing people say over the course of this last year. The fact that we stopped them and kept Israel as a democracy, I think, has made this moment of coming together possible. It has made it possible for us to effectively fight this war. So you wanted to ask about the next government.
Yeah.
Well, the next government, I think, will be some, as it looks now. I mean, look, there are so many variables. It really depends on how long the war takes, how many fronts we find ourselves fighting on. According to the polls, the old Bennett-Lapid coalition will get up to 70 seats. And that would include Mansour Abbas. I think with Abbas, you might get up to 75 seats. It's an astonishing turnaround. If Bennett runs, and my understanding is he's planning to run, the polls show him getting 16, 17 seats. This is a guy who couldn't cross the threshold, the electoral threshold, when he left office. And so everything's in flux. My sense is that we, again, seen from this moment, that we are going to have an historic transformation politically here.
Born without passport.
In Israel.
It's the other Abbas. He's 88. What happens when does the PA survive?
Nothing good, really. You know, you'll have, there are different scenarios. One is that there'll be some kind of a mini civil war. Another is that there'll be a Hamas grab because no one likes the PA. No one respects the PA. No one wants the PA. So is it Hamas? We're not going to let Hamas, obviously, take over in the West Bank. So these are questions that I don't know anyone who's thinking about. Honestly. They're all important questions, but I never hear them raised in an Israeli setting.
So not to throw our guide and our bus driver under, our guide and our tour organizer under the 100 bus, but in our conversations we were driving in, I was saying that the feeling is that that all of the change, all that's happening is being led by the people, and that the government is at best being reactionary, and that nobody's looking around the corner, nobody's looking ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. But the silver lining there, and I think that's absolutely right, the government did not mobilize this country. We mobilized ourselves. Something like 50% of Israelis since October 7th have engaged in some form of volunteerism. 50% of the society.
That's because people are already organized around going out in the street.
Well, that was the initial impetus, the engine for mobilizing the society was the protest movement, which simply pivoted. It used all of its incredible contacts and skills to fill the gap that this government of national disgrace left in civil society. But the silver lining for me is that I see this moment as the great moment of maturation for Israeli society. If in the past, think of Israel 40 years ago, 50 years ago, if we would have had to go to war with a leadership that the country fundamentally mistrusted, not just mistrusted their judgment, but mistrusted their intention, their decency. Are you on our side? I don't think Netanyahu wakes up in the morning thinking, what can I do for Israel today? I don't think that's in his mind. 40 years ago, Israelis, I think, would have been lost. Think of how important the charismatic leadership of this country was. Now, we have led ourselves. We've never experienced anything like this before. on the one hand, I lie awake at night thinking, how is it possible that we have the worst government in our history at this moment? How?
But maybe that's why you have this moment.
So, well, that's it. That is why. That's exactly why. But the balance there is that we have a society that we can really trust and really build on when this is over.
Population.
You had your hand up. Sorry.
I wanted to ask how much power you think government has.
How much?
Power, effect government has on the length of the war.
On the length of the war?
How long it will take.
I've heard the conspiracy theories or anxieties that Netanyahu is going to deliberately prolong the war in order to buy himself more time. I'm sure he would if he could, but he's not the only actor there. And there's the security cabinet. There's the army. He can't do what he wants here. And the country wants the war to continue. We don't want this to stop. So in that sense, I'm not concerned about that.
The population, and part of what brought Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and this moment is that whether it's the Haredi population, the national religious population that swelled, you give a sense that community has changed opinion of those leaders?
Not at all. Not at all. I think that when you see the polls that say 30% support Netanyahu as prime minister, it's coming from there. You look at the polls of Likud voters. Likud voters have turned away from him massively. It's coming from the religious communities. And the blame for the democracy movement for October 7th is also coming largely from there. So the divide between liberal Israel and the Orthodox communities is, I think, as deep as ever. The only hope that I see there is for the soldiers coming back from the front who have had a very different experience. And there I think we're going to see the nucleus of some new leadership of part of the religious Zionist community with other parts of Israeli society. There was a meeting last week between leading rabbis of the religious Zionist community with Achim Laneshek, who I know you're meeting with. And it was a very warm meeting, but I read some of the transcript and I was appalled by some of the things that some of the rabbis were saying. I was furious. And one of the rabbis said, "We couldn't understand where your hatred for us came from." Now, that hatred was so not one way. The hatred that was coming from the religious community to the protest movement, who was driving cars through the crowds, violence. The real hatred was coming from right to left, right to center, right to secular. And so that was just one example. And when someone else said, another rabbi said, "We couldn't understand why you were so vehement against reforms that were intended to make the country more democratic." And I read that and I say, well, Rabbi, you and I have nothing to talk about. Nothing. And that's really, that's still there. The rage on both sides is still there.
So we couldn't understand is not we now do. We still don't understand.
But I guess what makes you think that the war experience is going to have a generational shift for kind of bridging that gap as opposed to
Because
widening it through
because it
radicalization.
will among the young people who serve together in the army. And the fact that Achim Laneshek had such a seminal role to play in helping get the country organized in the immediate aftermath of the massacre
So like that,
changed a great deal of perceptions. I got an email. I won't tell you his name. He's a journalist who I think you would probably all know, who had been vehemently against the protest movement. And he's a close friend of mine, and he and I had some tense moments around this. And he wrote an email to me apologizing and saying, I didn't understand what the protest movement was, who you were. And I took you all for spoiled left-wingers. And I didn't understand that you really were the backbone of this country. And
so I guess in terms of organization, like units are, it's not like that there's separate Datilu units. Yeah, like it is something that still is a sort of.
yeah, of course, it's together, reserved in even in Hester, they serve in general units when they're in the army. No, the army, the units are integrated. There are Haredi units that are separate, but not many. You know, we hear a great deal more about these units than actually exist.
I think here 10 years ago, the sort of concern that as a lot of the IDF infrastructure was coming more under the influence of some of the Datilu communities, that it was, and again, I don't know.
Yeah, but the units are all mixed. I mean, yes, it's true that there are a lot more officers, and you look at the casualty rates. My impression is that probably close to half of those who have been killed since the land invasion are from that community.
Right.
That's they're 15% of the society, close to 50% of the casualties. So, but when you're in the army, it's that's not so far that's not an issue. The army has still managed to maintain its ability to be broad. Yeah, so that's very good news.
We have time for just one or two more questions.
How would you describe the centering sort of at the left and centering a part of the right, but the community that is least likely to send people to the army is that right? And I know for my sister-in-law, like, she held all the protesters in her. That's what she's taught here, right? In her community.
Are we talking about Haredim or national religious?
Now she's
Mhm.
she just believes whatever she's, and I hear from my brother-in-law. So it's like, but how do you, if you can center the rest in so many ways, what hope is there?
Well, look, first of all, I think that two things will, my sense is, again, really big question marks, but speculating from this moment, that there are two opposing political trends that could play out after the war. On the one hand, there will be an increase in the far right, inevitably. I think that's this event is the formative experience of a whole new generation of Israelis, and it is an overwhelming experience. So the far right is one response to that. On the other hand, what I sense among Israelis, not in the Haredi camp, but in parts of all the other camps, is a longing for some way to calm Israeli society down. That we will have, when this war ends, we will have gone through the worst period in Israel's history, by far. Between this last year, October 7th, the war, there's never been anything remotely like this. And I think that there's going to be a pull toward the center right. And Benny Gantz is so far the unquestioned next prime minister, unless the right pulls out somebody very attractive. I don't see anybody there, really. But in terms of the Haredim, look, there has been some shift happening in the Haredi community since October 7th. There's a lot more willingness to identify with the army. There are hundreds of Haredim who volunteered for the army after October 7th. I wouldn't make too big a deal out of it in practical terms. They went in basically for 2 weeks. They were family people. It was a symbolic service, but they it's the symbolism is important because it's acknowledging that the army is important to Haredim as well. And that could have a gradual impact on more Haredim wanting to volunteer. I hear that Haredim who are in the army feel more comfortable now going back to their communities in uniform. In the past, they would take their uniforms off. So there's a shift. On the other hand, we're hearing some terrible things being said by leading Rashi Yeshiva from Mir, from Yeshivat Hebron, which are just, I'm not even going to bother repeating it, but just the worst kind of demeaning attacks on secular Israel, on the army, on soldiers. It's just, and the commentators say that leading Rosh Yeshiva are sharpening their rhetoric because they're afraid that they're losing ground in their own community. So it's an interesting moment. And one of the things I saw, which was very interesting, was after the Rosh Yeshiva of Mir, which is one of the most important yeshivot, came out and mocked soldiers and said the only thing that's important is Torah study. There was a terrific video that a Haredi woman came out with, vehemently attacking him.
Wow.
Now that was interesting to me. So I think nothing is solid. If there's any takeaway, I don't know if it went viral. I happen to see it. I don't know. And in the Haredi world, you can't admit if a video goes viral, right? Because you're not supposed to see it. But I maybe the last thing that I'll say to all of you is that everything that I said to you tonight, everything is with a question mark, because we are in radical flux. And what seems to be true right now may not be true a month from now. So that may be good news, it may be bad news, but zemayesh.
So can you take a picture of us just sitting here first, and then maybe get Yossi? Yossi, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.